All right, we're looking today at Andy Naselli's article, A Brief Introduction to Verbal Aspect in New Testament Greek. And you should have read this by the time you're watching this article. And we will comment on this as we go along. Let's begin with prayer, and we'll get started. Father, thank you for this day, for the opportunity to study language and the New Testament language in particular. I pray that you would make our time profitable for these men understanding. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. So, on the first page, you were introduced to key pieces of literature in the discussion. Porter's verbal aspect in the Greek of the New Testament, Fanning's verbal aspect in New Testament Greek, and then D.A. Carson kind of did an introduction to that in Biblical Greek Language and Linguistics. We have all of these in our library, so if you're interested in looking at these. And then Constantine Campbell's verbal aspect, the indicative mood and narrative. I'm not sure if that one we have, but we probably do. So, did you have any questions over the introductory paragraphs before the meaning of verbal aspect theory, or comments? Anybody have any questions or comments on the first page? Okay, moving on to page 18, the meaning of verbal aspect theory. Based on what you read, Sam explained the difference between semantics and pragmatics.
Semantics is a contextual meaning, and pragmatics is contextual.
Okay. And can you give me an example of that makes sense to you?
An example of a contextual meaning?
Both, semantic and...
I'll do examples. I do explanations. So, if you want me to try to further explain it, I'll do that.
No, you need example. An example's important. Brandon, can you come up with an example?
Yes. Something that comes to mind would be, just a good example, but a word that can have two meanings, and you have to look at the concept. I guess that would be pragmatic. So, the same English word that can mean two different things, like blue.
Okay.
So,
I'm feeling blue, and this book is blue. So, semantics, blue has multiple senses that are embedded in it. Pragmatically, the senses are narrowed in a specific context. Okay, that's a good example. Here's another example. If I say, Sam, your son is doing better, and he nods, yes, he's doing better. Your just signifies relationship. But if Sam says to his wife, look what your son has done, by using your in that context, he has distanced himself from the son, gave the ownership to the wife, and the communication is different. Okay? Your is pragmatically communicating displeasure, communicating at least emotional distance from the subject. Okay? So, and that's a case that's different from the word blue, because blue inherently has these semantic options, whereas your does not contain any semantics of emotional distance or displeasure. That semantic content is added by the context. Okay.
How's that different from acontextual meaning and contextual? How's that?
It's not. Those are examples of them. Yeah, it's not different from. It is that.
Well, I guess I wonder why that isn't good enough. Why isn't that acontextualized meaning contextualized? Is it just too ambiguous?
Well, the word semantics has been around a long time. It comes from a Greek word that means meaning. And so somebody invented the word pragmatics here relatively recently. So we just like to have terms. Okay. Now, my example of your is closer in kind to what happens with Greek tenses than the example with blue. Because a Greek tense will have information added to it from the context that it did not bring to the context. Whereas blue has information stripped out of it, so to speak. And only one of its meanings are intended. Questions?
We're missing a ton of stuff in the text by not being first century Greek speakers.
I hope not. I hope it's no more than 20%. I think actually it's more likely that we read stuff into the text that a first century person would not have read into it because we're not sufficiently familiar with the normal patterns of speech, and so things strike us as unusual that would have struck nobody as unusual then.
We being even like a professional exegete would maybe read something and be struck as something unusual.
Well, I mean, professional depends on how broad his exposure is to Koine literature. We includes everybody prior to the 1900s because our knowledge of Koine literature was minuscule then compared to what we have available to know now. But the sad thing is, as I think I said to you last semester, that out of the multiplied thousands of documents that have been found in Koine literature, less than 1% has been published. Therefore, we are basing our grammatical, syntactical, lexical analysis of Greek on less than 1% of the extant literature that could be studied.
Why don't they publish the answers?
There are political reasons for that.
Such as the place in mind.
No, such as the library that has them, who they let get to them, why they let them get to them, what strictures they place on access, venues they require publication through. Okay, good. So I think we understand the difference between pragmatics and semantics. Are you comfortable talking about what he says here in the second full paragraph under the meaning of verbal aspect theory, that the semantics of a tense form indicates only the author's subjective portrayal of an action?
If there was the word only, so since words are limited to the author's subjective portrayal all the time, everywhere, how it always is only that.
Well, Wallace is going to argue that that's not the case.
Yeah, which is.
And I think he makes an important point that certain verbs have one given tense form available to them. So when there's no choice, there's no significance.
So we are, only is already wrong, then only is already gone.
Well, his only is qualified by according to verbal aspect theory. So he's describing verbal aspect theory. Okay. Yeah. Okay. And then the overall pragmatics indicates the action's objective nature. Well, I'm quite confident that is a generalization, and that in fact anybody in the verbal aspect theory camp would say, no. The overall pragmatics may indicate the action's objective nature, or they may not. It's still a portrayal. So, think maybe of semantics. I don't know what kind of exposure you all have to art. Do you know what an impressionist picture looks like? Somebody's taken a little sponge and they've done a lot of sponge dotting of the picture. So it's very blurry and can only, to get the picture, you have to stand at a distance from it. A realist in art is doing his best to reproduce the details of what he is portraying. Now, is it wrong to have an impressionist picture of Paris? No, it's just kind of like looking at Paris with your eyes really squinty closed and everything looks fuzzy. Okay, and you can look at it that way. Is it right? Is the artist right because he chose to paint the picture realistically? No, he might have gotten a detail wrong. Maybe he put the building in the wrong place. Maybe he got the proportions slightly wrong. So in fact, the accuracy of the realist's portrayal depends on his skill as an artist. And in the same way, the accuracy of an author's portrayal depends on his skill as a communicator, and secondly, on the nature of his intention. It's like we don't look at an impressionist artist and say, what a pathetic artist. He couldn't paint a realistic picture if he wanted to. Okay? No, we say his intention was to create an impression of a scene, not a detailed representation. Okay? So when we come to the biblical text, we have to understand the author's intention. Is he intending to provide precise detail, or is he intending to give generalized information? Okay, there's a whole range of intentions that are possible for a communicator. Just like in first-year Greek, I say things that you find out aren't quite right in second-year Greek. Like the genitive means possession, and you've probably, if you heard somebody say that, you'd laugh and say, yeah, that and a whole bunch of other things too. Okay. Well, I was generalizing for that level. And my communication was both truthful and accurate in terms of my intention.
Can we know what the author's intention is? Like it seems, in my mind, I'm thinking of, I can't think of anywhere in the New Testament. Luke is very specific, Mark is a little bit impressionistic, I guess. But is there anywhere where they say, I'm going to focus on the exact detail instead of...
No, we don't do that. And painters don't either. They don't label their paintings realistic. You come to it and you say, oh, that's a realistic painting because I see all the detail. Style, yeah. So the reason you say Luke is more detailed is because you've noticed Luke paying attention to detail. Mm-hmm. So you read the Greek vocabulary and you say, wow, Luke uses a different word here than Matthew uses, and this word is much more technical. So this gives us a feel for Luke's attention to detail. Okay, Peter, what was your question?
if this is the right time to bring it up, I wrote down to remember to ask you, in first year, you always had us remember or memorize the definition of mood that involves the author's portrayal.
Yes.
So where does mood come in? I know we're talking about tense, but there's something I'm supposed to be putting together.
Oh, yes. The categories of semantics and pragmatics apply to every component of language, not simply to tense. Brandon's example with the word blue was an example of lexical semantics versus lexical pragmatics, focusing on a word. So was mine. Let's talk about mood semantics. The indicative portrays the action as taking place, portrays the action as real. That's the semantics. Pragmatically, I may use sarcasm with the indicative mood to imply that it didn't happen.
Wallace talked about ontology and phenomenology.
Yes.
Applying to every aspect of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. So, traditionally, grammar has talked about the use of the genitive, the dative, the accusative. That's the pragmatics of the genitive. What's the semantic content of the genitive itself? Acontextualized? Oh, something like a relationship with, of some kind. You know, what's the semantic value of a dative? Kind of hard to say exactly. It's like it's more like a word that's maybe got three senses: ethical, location, instrumentality, and then it gets narrowed by the context. Okay. All right. I liked his example at the top of page 19 to demonstrate the choice of a tense involves subjective portrayal. With John 6:11, the synoptics, one choosing the imperfect in John 6 and the other choosing the aorist, diadochen. Okay, so was he giving repeatedly, or what did he just give? Was it a one-time action, or was it repeated? Was it ongoing in the past? Well, it's portrayed one way, it's portrayed the other way. So this should temper our use of the text for making dogmatic statements about what must have happened, the nature of the action that must have taken place. Okay. Now,
it just reduces how much we say.
How much we say, that's right. That's what I mean by temper.
Because it could be the other's nature.
Well, just because there's minimal necessity.
Yes. Now, I think in postmodernist contexts, this would become an excuse for deconstructing the text, saying you can't know anything about what the text is saying. But we have solid evidential as well as presuppositional reasons to believe that the author of Scripture is God, that the character of the author is truth, and therefore we assume that the author intends to communicate an accurate, whatever level of accuracy, portrayal of reality. God's not lying to us. So I can say the act of giving bread took place. And I will assume that the more specific portrayal comes closer to the reality than the less specific and more general portrayal. So an aorist is the most general tense for the portrayal of an action. An imperfect is more specific because it involves linearity as part of its semantics. Wallace is going to say, not only must we consider the semantics of the tense form, we must also consider the semantics of the verb itself and additional grammatical factors that may weigh in when we decide what the Aktionsart, that is, the nature of the action really being portrayed in the story. And I'm going to assume, as a starting assumption, that the Aktionsart and reality are the same, unless the context gives reason to think that the Aktionsart in the text may be different from what really happened. So are you comfortable with well, let's just
I have a question about that.
mhm.
I mean, so if the Aktionsart represents reality, then it seems like he's saying that with aspects, it isn't as if it's not representing reality. It's just a way of looking at reality that differs, like within, without, levels of remoteness, and both being within, without. So it's not as if it's not. It really seems like it's sort of a contextualization of reality. Sort of like a theory of relativity, so to speak.
I think that's fine.
I guess I was wondering because, yeah.
Okay.
So I mean, I guess the question, I mean, for me, I'm just wondering because I see like like what you're saying, the Aktionsart always has aspect part of it.
Sure.
So if the Aktionsart as a whole, maybe I'm committing the fallacy of division, but if the Aktionsart as a whole is representing reality, and each part of the Aktionsart is inductively a part of how the Aktionsart is representing reality, then the aspect would, to some degree, represent reality from a matter perspective.
Yes, that's right. So do I want to say I was eating supper last night, or do I want to say I ate supper last night? Both are true, and I can portray it one way or the other. Now it's not true that I ate supper and I didn't eat supper, right? So we're not involving logical contradictions when we change perspectives. Now, here on page 19, he says, aspect is to semantics as Aktionsart in time is to pragmatics. Okay. So the verbal aspect is the semantic content of a tense. And the pragmatic meaning of a text is a function of the actual action being portrayed, the Aktionsart, plus time. Plus time.
Whoa, can you say that that last part again?
The pragmatic meaning of a tense is a function of the actual action, the nature of the action, plus time.
So that's the contextual items, including the aspect, plus time.
Well, the context is what's going to signify time. So context is the basis upon which you determine both Aktionsart and time. Okay. So verbal aspect theory wants to say that the present indicative tense form says nothing about time. That time is not a part of the semantic content of a present indicative tense form. That it's only a part of the pragmatic meaning of that form in a context.
Do they say that because it's not a necessary condition for the
No, they say that because they find the present tense form referring to future events, sometimes referring to past events, and so
That's what I was thinking, yeah.
the exceptions to the norm have led some grammarians to say, well, there is no norm. And that's where I jump off the verbal aspect theory ship. Okay. It's very common for logical people to want everything to be neat. And if there's anything language isn't, it's neat. Okay. Its irregularities and contortions appear to be genetic. Okay. Divinely designed, if I can say. Okay. And there's historical reasons for their contortions as well. So I argue that the present indicative does grammaticalize, which is another technical term for have as part of its semantic content time. It means the now. And can you strip time out of a present indicative form through contextual means? Yeah, sure. You can strip the time out, just like we stripped semantic content out of the word blue by putting it in with the word feeling. I'm feeling blue. But that doesn't mean that it didn't have that content before it got stuck in that context. Yes. Mm-hmm.
So the verbal aspect theorist knows or thinks that time is present and thinks that it is dependent on the tense form, but it's just not a part of its semantic. It's simply a part of what's happening in that context. The tense form can signify time pragmatically in the context.
No, the context will supply the time in which the tense form exists.
Then where in the context, besides the tense form, are they seeing time?
Well, particles like now, after this. They're going to probably argue that some words, so when you add tense form plus lexical information like ginomai in the aorist indicative is always past time. And so that combination of ginomai plus aorist plus indicative equals past action. But in general, and you know, I want to love my brothers who are verbal aspect theorists the way I would want to be loved, and that is, you know, grammar is a descriptive enterprise, right? We're describing what we find. It's not a prescriptive enterprise, telling it how it has to be done. And sometimes we describe things a certain way because it's easier to understand them that way than to describe them another way, which may actually be more accurate, but is harder to understand. Okay. And I think people like Porter and Campbell sympathize with people like Wallace and say, well, yeah, the way you explain it, it makes good sense, but we don't really think it's that way in reality. And we think it's more important as a grammarian to say what things really are than to say what they look like because it's easier to say it that way. And Wallace is going to respond, well, that may be the case, but I think they really are the way I'm describing them. And just happen to disagree with you about the way things really are.
Your question, I have a question about what you said about time. Wallace, under element of time, participles, he said the times are for the most part the same. The form of reference is all that has changed when. And I took him to be saying that it's not that somehow tense has lost the time aspect, but it's just the reference of which the time that like a present tense perhaps would have has changed, and the examples that seem to go against present tense having the type of time that it normally communicates.
So he said, quote, the times are for the most part the same. The frame of reference is all that has changed. And what he's talking about by frame of reference is absolute time as a time of frame of reference versus time relative to the main verb.
Well, yeah, I understand what he's saying, but I just wonder if that would also apply to what you're saying. I mean, because it seems like what you're saying is that there's counter examples so that whenever you have a present indicative, the tense form doesn't always have, the present isn't always indicating time that's actually in the present.
That's correct. That is correct.
But I wonder if that's the case, then, I mean, if we're just being descriptive of language, like you're saying, that we couldn't say that the present, present indicative has as a necessary condition indicating present time, unless
we say normal condition instead of necessary.
It's generally the case.
Generally the case.
But I wonder if are the aspect theorists trying to go back there and saying there's a part of the aspect of a tense that is the same under every condition, and that's what the tense. Actually, I have another question after this, so I'm sorry if I'm taking up so much time. But that part is what the tense is. Is either solely trying to communicate, or for the most part, is part of the communication of the tense form itself.
Maybe so, and so let's assume that that's what they're wanting to do. They're saying strip this down to the necessary components that are always there. Okay. But when it comes to exegesis, and you see this particularly in Constantine Campbell, you get statements like, well, the perfect tense could have any temporal reference. It could refer to the future, it could refer to the present, it could refer to the past. And that's where I say, wait a minute, that statement ignores the statistical norm that the perfect tense is past referring. Okay? You can't use a 3% deviation from the statistical norm to justify saying the perfect tense can have any temporal reference. Okay? That seems to cut it loose from temporal moorings. So I'm not at all opposed to saying what's the least common denominator.
And that's kind of what you mean by this isn't an exact science.
That's true.
This language you just can't completely box up every nook and cranny.
Yeah.
Now, my second question has to do with sort of our process seems to be getting at semantics through the back door, so to speak.
We have to.
So, like by coming through pragmatics.
It's impossible to do it otherwise.
There's no way to just tap right into the forms and I'm just
You know? I mean, think about what happened with hieroglyphics. Nobody got a vocabulary list with Greek equivalents. Instead, what they got is a text. And they had to infer semantic content from contextual usage. That's how we learn most of our words in English. We hear them in a context, and we start to fill in their semantic content. Sometimes we do it wrongly. And then we misuse a word and are embarrassed to find out that the semantic content isn't what we thought it was.
Yeah, I've never done that.
all of us, everybody's done it. Somebody says, that's not what that word means. And you say, yeah, it is. Look it up. Look it up. No, it's not. Ah!
I have a question.
Okay.
Regarding an objection to the aspect theory. There's a question from this article that says, if a tense form semantics does not grammaticalize time, what determines time? And then it gives an answer of adherence or pragmatic factors determine time, like context, especially
Deixis.
So I was wondering, they say pragmatic factors determine time, but in all contexts, is there always going to be pragmatic factors that determine time?
No,
And that's one thing I was thinking about. It doesn't make sense.
Well, I've got a great example in Galatians chapter 6 where Paul, in a sentence that is temporally disconnected from what went before or what goes after, uses an aorist indicative form followed by a present indicative form. I told you this before, and I'm telling you again. Now, there's no word before. It's just, I told you, and I'm telling you. And I say, look, Paul expects them to understand that proelegon is, I told you before, I told you in the past. Lego, I'm telling you now. And so, just the only information he's giving them about time is tense form.
Yeah.
And therefore it tells me that tense form can and does grammaticalize time. So I think it was I'm convinced.
Why do you ask that curious feel the need to throw all time out of the semantics?
Because they can multiply, let's say 30% of aorist tenses are not past referring. They say, wow, that's a lot of aorist tense uses that aren't past referring. And I say, well, yeah, that is a lot, but there's 70% that are. Don't forget the 70, even if it's 60-40. Now, if it gets down to where it's 50-50, then we've got a question about, when you're in that close of a range, then, which side's the norm and which side's the exception, or maybe we've got a misunderstanding of what really the root meaning, the semantics of this tense form are. But there aren't any tenses like that where you're playing around between 57 and 53, or,
Do you think that the type of literature that the New Testament is affects the statistics of tenses? And why I'm asking is because it seems like it's referring to history. This happened, instead of something like a story, which would be in the present.
Well, we get plenty of stories. Both Septuagint. See, we're not just working with the New Testament. We've got the Septuagint and the whole range of literature that's available there. We've got Josephus, we have Philo, we have Plutarch. We've got a large scale of data.
All of that is pointed.
Pardon me?
Everything you just noted is point A, agree?
Yes.
And the statistics of the New Testament there as being 70% run parallel with the
I
other.
think they're actually higher in other Koine literature. Where you're going to find aorist being non-past referring is in poetry, in axioms that are intended to be universal and therefore atemporal in their focus. So we get a phrase like the grass withers and the flower fades. And those are aorist passive indicatives. What in the world? But you recognize the genre, you know, an apothegm or an axiomatic statement that's, and you say, oh, okay, well, the genre calls for atemporal communication. And in order to do that, they chose the aorist. Why? Who knows? Maybe that's because that's the way axioms have been passed down in Greek for hundreds of years, and you just use the aorist. You know, maybe the author doesn't really even have a choice about their tense form. And the way to falsify that conclusion would be to show a body of axioms that use the present tense. And then you'd say, oh, okay, there is a choice. So what's that choice signify?
I have a question. Why does that specific example call for about temporal?
Axiomatic truth is something that's true at all times, past, present, and future. It's not true simply in the present or in the past.
It's supposed to be like self-evident, right?
So,
Grass withers. I mean, always has, always will.
what would be another one just to help?
People die.
Okay, I get it.
So, should I be walking away from this being informed of the discussion and understanding the importance of aspects as far as author's subjective portrayal or the author's intent, but should I also note that the author's portrayal doesn't necessarily reflect on the accuracy of what happened, and I also need to not throw time out of my understanding of.
And by all means, don't throw time out of your understanding. When you do the Wesleyan Theological Journal analysis this semester, I think you will have a deeper appreciation of the practical significance of your awareness of this discussion. Okay? So, hang on and watch somebody do exegesis without an awareness of this discussion and see what happens. The guy you're going to read. If you want to see exegesis with an awareness of this discussion, read my article on is a Wesleyan understanding of 1 Thessalonians 5:23 exegetically tenable. Okay. And I make reference to this discussion and all of this literature and seek to couch my description of what the passage means in language that reflects my awareness.
Are you talking about the response of Warfield and
Yeah.
and that's not fair. They weren't part of this discussion.
Warfield?
Warfield wasn't, was he?
No, I don't. I mean, I'm not. I don't have any bone to pick with Warfield on this topic. But when I make a positive case for what I think the text means, I then use these tools to distinguish semantic from pragmatic and
Which you didn't even have available.
no, right, yeah. So I don't criticize him about that at all.
I kind of like Warfield.
Oh yeah, there's lots to like about Warfield. So hopefully there's lots to like about me, and most likely somebody will come along and have a bone to pick with me somewhere sometime.
I have one more question.
Okay.
Regarding the same I had another objection. I just want to maybe throw it out on the way. time, but does not the semantics of the future tense form grammaticalize future time? I thought this was interesting because
Yeah.
of the future tense form grammaticalize future time. I thought this was interesting because
Yes, I think aspect theorists argue
say,
that the future is an exception.
I don't get that. It's only one, you get to choose which one.
Well, the reason for saying it's an exception because it's like 99.9% of the time the future tense grammaticalizes future time. So how can you say it doesn't grammaticalize time?
I wouldn't say that. I would ask if other tenses would not carry future, I guess, instead of just
Well, yeah, okay. That's a legitimate question.
future.
Do you know what deixis is?
I think it's referring to time. That's what
No, deixis is a word that refers to words that point. They can point at time or they can point at persons or reference. So this is a deixis, deictic word. This book, it points. Now is a deictic word that points at time. Here on the timeline. Then, before, after. When is a kind of generic deixis word. It doesn't really locate where on the timeline you are, but it just says we're in a time. And I say when dinosaurs roamed the earth, you immediately think past. If I say when men teleported themselves by thinking, I want to be there, you say, hadn't happened, isn't happening, must be future. Okay. So that's what we mean by deixis.
So, aspect, could aspect be thought of in one sense as when it refers to a kind of action, that in one sense, kind of action just means an author's relationship to things outside of himself. It's not as if it has some description of the nature of action itself.
Well, I mean, the perfect tense just really doesn't work with that because the majority of instances indicate not an author's relationship to the action, but the nature of the action itself, that it's complete.
Well, I'm asking about what someone who advocates aspect theory for on table 2, no relationship to time in it.
I've never heard anybody say what you just said, so I don't think so. It's not, again, it's the author's choice of how to present the action. I think of aspect as a ballpark. You've got the linear action ballpark, you've got the view the action as a whole ballpark, and the completed action with continuing results ballpark. And if I say an act is inside that ballpark, that doesn't tell you whether it's right field, left field, home plate, third base, second base, in the stands, in the dugout, right? And all of that stuff is kind of pragmatics.
It's still sort of phenomenological, though, right?
It has to be.
And that's the necessity of the context.
Yeah.
Sort of reels it in to what.
But I could put it in the aorist ballpark. And that's where the ballpark analogy is going to fall down, because the aorist ballpark is a different place than the present ballpark. But the action out there was the same action. My action of eating is one. I can say I ate or I was eating. The portrayals are different. Was eating focuses on the fact that it involved some process. Ate doesn't tell me that. It just says it happened. It could have been, I took a bite and I ate. But most singular events can be subdivided if you move close enough. Okay? So we can say there's one seed, but you get close enough and you find that in the seed there are multiple cells. Okay, so that's why almost any event can be portrayed from multiple angles. All right, well, we're 10 minutes over, 11 minutes over. I hope that the discussion is helpful. We'll continue implementing and refining your understanding of this as we go along.